Welcome to Ask Sean, where I explore all sorts of questions about being human and invite you, the listener, to become more present to yourself, your relationships, and your life. I'm Sean Slevin, a licensed professional counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist. And if you have a question for me, you can send that to me anonymously at asksean.org. So in this video, I want to talk about a question or a variation of questions that I get periodically that goes something like, how can I not be so overwhelmed by other people's emotions? And again, I get lots of variations of this. Sometimes people will say, how can I block out kind of other people's emotions? Or people will say, oh, you're a therapist. How are you not overwhelmed by that? How are you not exhausted by that? How do you not take your work home with you? Things like that. Sometimes people will say, I'm an empath and I feel things really deeply. And so when other people experience things, it can be really overwhelming and can bring up, so much intensity in me. How can I do something about that? How can I not have that happen? So one of the things that's interesting about some of the versions of this question is there can be kind of embedded a presupposition that feeling things is bad. Sort of this kind of a prejudice, I would say, in our culture, that I shouldn't have overwhelming feelings, that overwhelming feelings are a thing to be eliminated or to be gotten rid of. And there's a kernel of truth in this, in the sense that the goal is should not be to be overwhelmed. Being overwhelmed isn't helpful. But where there's a bit of an error, I would say, often in some of how this question is approached and where our culture often is coming from, is that the problem is not big emotions. Big emotions are not problematic at all. They can be difficult, they can be unpleasant. What's problematic is often our capacity to be with those emotions is too limited. So let me unpack this. So we all have kind of a range or a window in which any emotions within this window, we are able to be present to them. We're able to feel what we need to feel. And it might be really difficult. It might be extremely intense, but we can stay with it. We can ride the waves of the emotion. And outside of that range, whatever our range is, for some of us, the range might be really narrow. Some of us, the range might be wider. But all of us have an edge, right? Have edges. And so outside of the range, whatever our edges are, that's where we start to get overwhelmed. That's where our nervous system is going to start to go into survival modes like fight, flight, freeze, collapse, etc. And this is true for all of us, no matter how healthy we are, no matter how much work we've done on ourselves. I have an edge. My range is really, really wide. It's much wider than the average human because I've had a lot of therapy as a client, and I'm always working at my edges. I'm always turning towards the difficult places inside of me. And so that oops, I just knocked my keyboard. That keeps expanding my range, right? But at my edges, I'm going to struggle, just like I always have. As a side note, this is why when we are growing and healing, we can have periods where we wonder, have I changed? Because when we're at the edges, we're always just beyond my edge, right? I'm going to feel the weakest, right? To use a weightlifting analogy, when you're doing those last few reps, like doing curls or something, and your muscles are starting to quiver, and then, they're about to give out. You feel your weakest, right? You feel the limits of your ability in that moment. And so we all have an edge, and there's no shame in that, right? The question is, are we expanding our capacity, right? So, because here's the key, the I don't know, secret, if you will, to unlocking. To tackling this question of what do I do about getting so overwhelmed by other people's emotions, or how do I not get so overwhelmed by other people's emotions? So the key is to start to recognize that it's not actually other people's emotions that is overwhelming me. It's my own emotions that are coming up in the context of and in response to their emotions. Now, this principle actually applies to like maybe everything. I mean, it applies to tons of stuff, right? It comes up all the time in couples work, where one person will say, my partner does X, Y, Z, and then I feel whatever difficult feeling. So I need my partner to stop that so that I'll stop feeling this. Now, they don't usually say it quite that articulate or quite that clear, because, we humans, we love to, not take responsibility for ourselves, and we like to, sort of blame others, right? Because that feels easier. It's less scary. It's less work. We do this unconsciously, all of us, myself included, right? But you can hear just by kind of the way I'm articulating it, you can potentially hear where I'm going here is that the ultimate problem isn't even the right word, but the thing to do something about is I've got to work with the emotions that are coming up in me. Now, this doesn't mean other people don't have responsibility, right? Like if the thing that the other person is doing, whether it's a partner or a friend or whatever, if the thing they're doing is like, shouting curse words at me or something, it's like, okay, well, that's probably not helpful and probably not necessary, so there are things to talk about there, right? But I'm not going to be able to have that conversation fruitfully until I deal with my own emotions. So this, whether that seems fair or not, it's just how it is. Like, I've got to grapple with, what is this inviting me to look at? This has been a huge thing for me in my own journey, is recognizing that so many moments in life, maybe every moment, is somehow inviting us to grow and to heal and to look at, like, what in me is asking for more healing? What in me is wanting to grow, is wanting my attention? Because we are beings that are meant for growth. We're meant for expansion. This is one of the interesting things. So, I was making the analogy about weightlifting earlier, right? So there's going to be hard limits in terms of how strong a human can get. I suspect. I'm not a weightlifting expert, but it seems to me that curve is not infinite, right? That they're, in a given human, no matter how hard they work, they're going to reach their max, right? Where it's like in the most perfect conditions, maybe this is the most they could lift, or this is the highest they could jump. That doesn't mean there couldn't be a different human with a different, set of variables in terms of their makeup and, and whatnot, where they might be able to get a little further. So I couldn't presume to know, like, what is the ultimate max of, like, lifting weights or, running or whatever in terms of humans. I mean, that's a more fuzzy thing. But I suspect, it seems to me that there are these hard limits, right? I mean, just for example, our lifespan, right? Like, we die, pretty consistently. Humans, I mean, sometimes there's these exceptions where someone lives a bit longer than normal, but it's still, we're doing well to reach, 80, 90, 100, and, and it's really exceptional, when someone's going beyond 100 years, right? So there are these various hard limits about our physical experience. I think, though, I suspect that our emotional capacity is different. I suspect that there might not be a hard limit. I suspect that if we work at it, that we could always expand our emotional capacity more. I mean, this is what I'm finding in my own life. And maybe at some point I'm going to hit a hard limit where it's like, I just can't grow anymore. And that's all that I can ever be with. But I don't think so. Like, that doesn't feel intuitively true to me. I think there's something about just how freaking powerful we are psychologically, spiritually, that we can keep expanding the range. This doesn't mean that we won't still struggle, right? Like, this is, don't mishear me. I'm not saying, this is the way to have a perfect, easy life. Like, no, like, it's hard being human. It will always be hard being human. But it's also really beautiful and really joyful, and it gets a lot more fun, and it gets easier in one sense the more that we expand our capacity to be present to difficult emotions, because then they're less difficult, right? And we're not being overwhelmed by them. We can feel what we need to feel, and we can move through the experience. can't remember if I said in a previous video or not, but I shared this with a number of clients. I had an experience a number of months ago now where something really sad happened. I got some rather painful news over the phone about something, and when I hung up the phone, I just burst into tears, and I cried for a solid half hour because I was really sad. It was something that was not how I wanted it to be, and it really hurt, and I was really sorrowful about it. I was really grieving, and this was a really remarkable experience because I was not fighting the emotion at all. I wasn't resisting it. I didn't feel ashamed about it. I didn't feel guilty about it. There was no conflict, which has not always been the case in my life, right? But it was just flowing, clean, clear, pure, and it hurt. It hurt a lot. I was really sad. I was really distraught. But I was present. I was present to all of it. And I felt everything I needed to feel for that chunk of time. And at the end of the half hour, my system just kind of wound down. That was kind of all that I had that I needed to feel. And then I cried again for another half hour the next day. And there's nothing magic about half hour. That's just how this particular experience went. But then I was kind of done. This particular thing, that was the grieving I needed to do. And there doesn't seem to be anything lingering with that. Now, there could be something, maybe something crops up later. It's like, oh, here's a little bit more that I didn't know about. But as far as I'm aware, I was able to be present to everything I needed to be present to. Or certainly, if we want to leave some of that room for error, right? I was present to a tremendous amount of it. There's nothing yet that I'm currently aware of that I wasn't able to stay with, wasn't able to feel. And so this is part of the gift of expanding our window, expanding our capacity of what we can be present to, is that we can feel difficult emotions. They can be painful, but they're not overwhelming. And so this is key then to our being with other humans. This is so fundamental to my work as a therapist, right? If I'm not doing my own work, my own inner work, just any of you that are fellow, mental health workers, fellow helpers, any of you that are thinking about going into this profession, we have to be doing our own inner work. That doesn't necessarily have to be technically in therapy. I don't care what the context is, but somehow or another, we have to have people and places and rhythms and ways of being where we are consistently turning towards the difficult and scary places inside of us and expanding our capacity to be with those emotions and those experiences psychologically, spiritually, relationally. So that there are less and less places in us that could get evoked by someone else's stuff in such a way that we're like, oh, fuck, I'm getting overwhelmed. And here I am trying to be with somebody else. And my own emotions are getting out of hand. I'm not out of hand in the sense that I'm losing my footing. So, this is huge to my work. And so this means then, this is reminds me of one of the ways I answered a form of this question to somebody once is I was like, well, actually, I don't try to not feel stuff. I just feel whatever I need to feel in session, and I feel it, and then I'm done. And so that's part of why I'm not taking my work home in the sense that I'm not typically leaving anything on the table. Whatever needs to be felt, I feel it. Now I can do that effectively and be an effective therapist, because I've been dealing with my own stuff so much outside of session that I'm not having some big thing come up in session typically, right? So if a client is crying, I might tear up with them, not because I'm triggered, but just because I'm being with them, I'm feeling the emotion with them. But it's not coming from an edgy space in me of oh, this is a little wobbly, I'm losing my footing. It's just my heart hurts for them. And I can feel that deeply and have emotions with them. But I also, this is a second principle, I'm not confused about what are my emotions and what are their emotions. This is the second thing, is that in order to not get overwhelmed by other people's emotions, we need to have a felt clarity of where do I end and someone else begin? What are my emotions and what are this person's emotions? Now, we're not going to have clarity on that when we've got all sorts of shit that we've been ignoring. Like, this is the thing, and folks don't always like it when I tell them this, when they ask questions like this, is I'll say, well, if you're feeling really big feelings in response to someone else's feelings, that probably means you've got your own stuff you need to attend to, you need to turn towards. And people want to be like, but I'm just empathetic, or, I'm an empath, or da-da-da. And you may be an empath, whatever exactly that means. That's a very loose, vague cultural definition. But you may be very empathetic. You may care a lot. And I want to suggest you might be misusing your caring for others partly as a way of scratching an itch to do with wounds of your own without actually dealing with those wounds directly. Because especially the degree to which you're having big emotions come up in response to someone else's experience, it's like, well, that's partly that you care about them, but it's also partly that you've got stuff you need to deal with. Like, I can feel very much for and with my clients, but it's not, again, it's like their experience. Like, I'm not confused about what's going, like what are my emotions, what are theirs, and I'm not having this outsized, this out of whack or whatever, inordinate amount of emotion, right? It's like, I know that this is their life, and I can't live their life for them. I can't feel their life for them, right? So I can feel compassion for them. I can feel sad. I can be with them in their fear, their shame, and and all those things. But I'm not confused about who am I and who are they, right? Like, and I'm not trying to deal with my emotions indirectly by trying to take care of them. I'm being with them in their emotions, and I'm having my own feelings for them and about them and whatnot and with them. But it's not, I'm not trying to work through something indirectly. Like, this is a huge, huge thing in our culture. A lot of and this is across the cultural spectrum. I don't care whether you're on the left or the right or independent or whatever. Like, I see this in all categories consistently, where people will be up in arms, or outraged, or like, beating the drum about different causes and causes that matter, right? I'm not like denigrating any cause or anything, but what I'm getting at is that the intensity of emotion that will be going on is largely indicative of things in those individuals that they are not addressing, but they're feeling a lot of it. I'm feeling all this emotion about this people group. And it's like, we should care about that people group, whatever the, people group of the moment is, right? But if we're like way up here, it's like, some of that might be my shit. Some of that might be my childhood wounds about how I wasn't taken care of, or how I was bullied, or how I felt disenfranchised, or I felt alone, or I felt not seen, or I felt like I didn't belong, right? And I'm not owning that, and so I'm displacing my pain about that, and my outrage, and my shame, and my cry for justice. I'm displacing some of that onto other people. And so then, in the presence of their emotions, I'm having all these big emotions, and I'm getting overwhelmed, and I'm losing sleep, and it's like, well, that's my problem. It's not their problem, and they can't fix that for me, right? Whether the they is a partner, or a people group, or a random stranger that we, talked to, at a public park or something, right? And they shared their story, and then we're all overwhelmed by it. So this, again, is the key thing, is that, like, if we want to get more clarity about what are my emotions and what are their emotions, if we want to expand that range, expand our capacity of what we can be present to in terms of our emotions, we have to practice turning towards them. We have to, first of all, kind of like listen to, like, okay, well, what's coming up in me? Is that fear? Is that shame? Is it pain and sadness? Feelings of loss, confusion, anger, right? That can be in there. Rage, longing, intense longing. Like, what is getting evoked in us by someone else's experience, by what they are sharing? And then outside of that moment of being with them, right? Like in our own time, can we start to turn towards that? Can we intentionally try to feel that a little bit? Now, if we are not practiced at this, this is where having a helper could be really helpful. So a good counselor, somebody who, and a good counselor is going to be someone who isn't just trying to, and I want to do a video on this maybe at some point too, but a good counselor is not just trying to make us feel better. In fact, that's not their primary goal. Their primary goal is they're trying to help us be with whatever we need to feel. And so they're not afraid of the difficult emotions. They're not trying to make it go away. Yeah, I probably should do a video on that at some point. But anyway, finding a counselor, some kind of mentor, some kind of helper, a friend, somebody who has more emotional capacity than we do, who can help us, who can sit with us and guide us a bit as we try to start to turn towards these places that we are really afraid of. Because that's the only way that they're going to get better, right? I mean, it's like a muscle. You have to work it. Like it doesn't just, you can't fix this with a pill. There's a place for medication. I've done videos about, kind of my thoughts, my nuanced thoughts about medication and the ways I feel like our culture misuses medication, and how I would, encourage us to think more constructively about medication. But treating medication, as just a magic fix is, that's really mean to oneself, right? Like that's saying to all of these hurt parts of ourselves, like, sorry, I don't care about you. I'm going to leave you locked away. I'm going to ignore you, right? Like if that was a child, which, often these are child parts, we would call that cruel. We have laws about that, right? There would be public outrage and outcry. So we have to practice turning towards these parts of us, whatever the ages are of the parts, right? These emotions, these experiences inside of us. And this is how we start to get more clarity on what are my actual feelings, right? This is how we come into more clear definition of, as this person shares their story about fill in the blank, I start to then be reminded of some of my story that I need to spend more time with. And so if the person we're with is a friend, well, we can acknowledge that. We can say, hey, I'm realizing this actually brings up some stuff for me as well. And, we'd be mindful of like not taking over the conversation, depending on the dynamic, if they were like, sharing a lot. But depending on the dynamic and the friendship, you may be able to take turns, right? And that can be a really lovely thing, and they reach a pausing point where they're like, yeah, I want to hear more about that. What was that bringing up for you? And be like, yeah, well, I'm reminded of this time in my life where da-da-da-da, and it was really hard for me. And I know it's not the exact same thing as yours. I'm not trying to make a direct comparison. It just evoked that. It reminded me. And I'm realizing I have a more emotion about that in my story, and I need to be with that. And so, what a sweet, intimate, like lovely moment of connection that could be, right? And that could be healing for both parties. Now, if it's a context like therapy, right? Like, if I had something like that, which again doesn't tend to happen for me because I'm dealing with my stuff so proactively outside of session. But if I had something come up in session, well, I've got the capacity that I can notice it, internally and be like, oh, I see you. I will come back to you here in a bit. Right now, I need to be with this person, with my client. But I see you and I won't forget about you. And then I have to keep my promise. And so I do circle back and I do feel into those feelings. And I've done this enough times that there's trust inside, right? Like my insides trust that I will, so I don't get hijacked typically, in a session, even if something does get pricked. And sometimes there's like, like the little hint of something of like, oh, yeah, that's like, there's a thing there I could tug at. Like, and it's not like overwhelming or anything, but it's like, I notice it. And if I didn't have more capacity, it could like be bigger and really distracting. And I'll just, I notice it. I kind of acknowledge it inside of myself and like, hey, I'll be back. I promise. Thanks for making yourself known. And so I can, I don't have to leave the session, right? All that can happen very quickly internally. That's sort of that awareness. And then I'm right back with the client. So yeah, so this again, coming back to this question of like, how do we not get overwhelmed by other people's emotions? We've got to be willing to recognize that it's actually our own emotions that are overwhelming us. It's our emotions that are coming up about our unresolved stuff, things that we haven't felt enough, that we haven't spent enough time with, that we haven't been able to be fully present to. We haven't finished feeling our feelings about. All these words are different ways of saying the same thing, right? And so that's getting evoked, that's getting stirred up, or we might say triggered, is kind of one of the words we use in our culture. That's getting brought to the surface by someone else's emotions. Or this might even happen by a movie, right? It happens by a movie or a TV commercial or, all sorts of external things. And so we have to learn to treat those things as gifts, even though they are uncomfortable and awkward and inconvenient. They really are gifts. They are invitations to turn towards hurting parts of us, to turn towards places that we have maybe been ignoring, that we haven't known that were there, or that we've intentionally been pushing away. Whatever the mixture is, this is another chance to turn back towards the hurting places in us. This is the beautiful thing about us humans. It's just like I was saying, I hypothesized that there might not be an upper limit to our emotional capacity, that we might be able to infinitely expand our capacity if we work hard enough at it and we're persistent. And in a similar way, another amazing thing is that we keep getting chances to heal. So it's like if you ignored something today, well, it will come up tomorrow or the day after or the day after. It will come up again because your soul is going to keep crying out to you. My soul will keep crying out to me. If there's something I'm not attending to, if there's something I'm not paying attention to, it's going to show up in my dreams in the middle of the night. It's going to, show up when I'm waiting in traffic, right? It's going to show up in random, relational encounters, when I least expect it. And though that is inconvenient, it is a gift. Because gosh, if it didn't show up and we were actually successfully able to ignore it, which is what our culture tells us to do, right? Well, then we're abandoning that part. That's like, think about how many movies we've had about like, kids who get stuck in a mine or stuck in a hole and then, all the effort that goes to rescuing them, right? Like, we recognize there the value of human life, that it's worth everything trying to save them. The same thing is true of the parts of us, the parts of you, every part of us, even the parts of us that we feel disgusted by or afraid of or repulsed by. They all matter. They all need us to know them and care for them and love them. It doesn't mean every part gets to drive the car, right? Like some parts, the nature of their wounding and blah, 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 they shouldn't be driving the car. But they need to be in the car. They need to be acknowledged, not in the trunk. They need to be in a passenger seat, right? Like we need to learn to treat these parts of us as valuable and not leave them buried forever. Like that would be cruel. So I know it's hard. I know it's scary. Believe me, like, oh my goodness. This work in my own life, it's been some of the hardest things that I've ever done, is turning towards parts of me again and 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 again. There's the makings of a song there. But like, because it doesn't end. There's just always more parts, and or always more bits of emotion to feel, more things that are unfinished. But it's so worth it, right? It is way better than avoiding. Like I have so much more I literally have more energy because I've freed up energy that used to have to be spent at like keeping stuff tamped down and just trying to hold it together. And now it's like, well, I don't have to do that because like I've like turned full on into that, and it was really fucking hard and really scary, but I had help, right? I reached out to helpers and I reached out to friends and I stuck with it and I stuck with it and I stuck with it. And now I can feel those things and just feel them, and it's okay. And like that example of, getting off that phone call and just crying for a solid 30 minutes, just sobbing, heaving sobs, was so sad, but was able to feel what I needed to feel, not leave anything on the table, right? Like I just felt, as far as I know, I felt it all, right? And I felt a bit more the next day that bubbled up, so it's like, and that's the thing too, is that the goal is to feel as much as we can in this moment. There can always be more. It's just I don't want to be restricting anything that's asking to come out right now, right? Because it's not like I can feel all of the emotions of my entire life, right? Like it is always in chunks, but any given chunk I want to be faithful with, like it's like I don't want to turn away a child that's hungry, inside of me. Like I want to feed them with my presence, with my caring about them, with my feeling with them and for them. So again, I know it's hard. I know it's scary. It can feel impossible. And in one sense it sort of is, right? Like in that it requires us to grow. It requires us to become more. And yet it's not impossible in that we actually can become more. We can expand. We can become larger psychologically, spiritually. And like I said, I don't think there's a limit to that. And so while there's a kind of dying, there's also a kind of resurrection that happens. So, yeah, if you're someone who struggles with feeling overwhelmed by other people's emotions, this is the invitation to you. To get curious about what are your emotions that you're having that are overwhelming to you, and to start trying to be with those, and to be with whatever memories they're tied to, whatever original experiences, and try to be present to all of it, bit by bit, step by step, moment by moment, such that you expand and your capacity to be with those places gets greater and greater, and thus easier. Well, until next time, peace be with you.